Most of us put our lives in the hands of doctors, trusting them to heal, comfort, and guide us through our most vulnerable moments. But what happens when that trust is broken in the most unimaginable way? In this story, we turn our attention to a small but haunting group, physicians who cross the line from healer to criminal, facing life behind bars or even execution. Their stories are a stark reminder that darkness can sometimes hide behind even the widest coat. Christopher Duntsch. There's a silence that follows Christopher Duntsch's name inside the halls of the Texas State Prison. Before all this, he wore a white coat and carried the confidence of a surgeon, a man trusted with scalpels, spines, and the fragile line between pain and hope. But in operating rooms across Dallas, Dr. Duntsch became known by another name, one whispered by victims and prosecutors alike. Doctor. Death. It wasn't some tabloid label. It was a title born of real horror, stitched from the stories of those whose lives he forever altered. Duntsch arrived in Texas brimming with ambition, a neurosurgeon with impressive credentials and a hunger for recognition. But as his career unfolded, his patients began to emerge from surgery with lives ruined, paralyzed, or in unbearable agony. Some would never walk again. 2 would not survive at all. Again and again, operating room staff reported chaos, reckless incisions, ignored warnings, and a chilling disregard for human life. Nurses whispered about botched procedures. Fellow doctors began to quietly refuse to work alongside him. It took years before anyone truly connected the dots, before the legal system caught up with the number of ruined bodies left in his wake. When the trial finally began, it wasn't just about malpractice or surgical mistakes. Prosecutors painted a portrait of a man who acted with such flagrant neglect that it bordered on intentional harm, knowingly maiming patients, showing gross disregard for human life. Jurors listened as patient after patient told their stories. One left quadriplegic, another dead, families shattered by grief. In February 2017, Christopher Duntsch was convicted of injury to an elderly patient, a charge that carried the weight of all his victims' suffering. The sentence was life in prison, a rare and resounding verdict for a doctor in America. He will not be eligible for parole until 2045, long after the headlines fade and his victims' families have marked too many anniversaries without their loved ones. Here, in the stark light of a prison cell, Duntsch's story stands as a chilling reminder. Trust can be a matter of life and death, and sometimes those with the power to heal become the architects of lasting pain. Kermit Gosnell. There's a different kind of quiet that hangs over the name Kermit Gosnell, one that's heavy with disbelief and revulsion. To most of his patients, Dr. Gosnell was simply the man in the white coat at a West Philadelphia clinic, a physician promising care where few others would. For years, he worked almost unnoticed on the fringes, operating what was supposed to be a place of healing. But behind the doors of his clinic, a nightmare played out that would shock even seasoned investigators. What began as a routine raid for illegal prescription drugs in 2010 quickly spiraled into a case unlike any the city had seen. Investigators, accustomed to seeing the worst, stepped into an environment so squalid and chaotic it defied belief. The walls were stained, the equipment was filthy, and the records were incomplete. But what truly stunned them were the bodies, the remains of infants kept in containers, and a patient who died under his care. Whispers about late-term procedures and corners cut for profit were suddenly under a glaring spotlight. Over months of hearings and testimony, the truth came out. Gosnell wasn't just violating regulations, he was ending the lives of babies born alive, and his disregard for patient safety had claimed the life of Karnamaya Mongar, a woman who'd sought his help. Staff members told stories of horror, and the jury listened as the evidence piled up. It wasn't just the law he'd broken, it was the fundamental trust between doctor and patient and the sanctity of the medical oath he'd once taken. In May 2013, the verdict was handed down. Guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder, involuntary manslaughter, and a host of related crimes. The punishment was as severe as the charges: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus decades more tacked on by the federal court. Gosnell, now an old man in a prison cell, will never again walk free or wield a doctor's tools. For the families left behind, and for a city still reeling from the details, the sentence is only a shadow of justice. In the end, his story remains a haunting reminder of what happens when unchecked power turns to harm, and how a healer's hands can become the instruments of irreversible loss. Jeffrey R. MacDonald. Jeffrey MacDonald's story is one that still echoes through American true crime. An Army doctor, a decorated Green Beret, and a young father living what seemed like a charmed life. But in February 1970, that carefully maintained image shattered in the most violent and bewildering way. On a cold night at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, military police arrived at the MacDonald family home to a scene almost too gruesome to comprehend. Jeffrey's pregnant wife, Colette, and their 2 young daughters, Kimberly and Kristen, had been brutally murdered. Jeffrey himself lay wounded, claiming he'd fought off a group of intruders. The initial investigation seemed to tilt in his favor. Jeffrey MacDonald, with his quiet confidence and medical background, described a home invasion by strangers, a story eerily reminiscent of the era's notorious Manson family murders. But as the months wore on, investigators began to see cracks in his narrative. The physical evidence, from bloody footprints to fibers and wounds, seemed to tell a different story, one of staged chaos and betrayal within the home's own walls. Years passed, and the case became an obsession for journalists and the public alike. Books were written, most notably Joe McGinnis's Fatal Vision, and debates raged about guilt and innocence. But in 1979, after nearly a decade of legal maneuvering, MacDonald was arrested and brought to trial. The courtroom drama gripped the nation, with prosecutors arguing that MacDonald himself was the killer, motivated by marital discord and perhaps a desperate need to maintain control over a life unraveling at the seams. The verdict was devastating. Jeffrey MacDonald was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. His punishment: life in prison 3 times over, 1 for each family member lost. He has always maintained his innocence, launching appeal after appeal, never wavering in his insistence that he, too, was a victim. Yet every request for release has been denied, every argument for exoneration dismissed by the courts. Now, in his twilight years, Jeffrey MacDonald remains behind bars, a physician who once pledged to save lives, now forever remembered as the center of one of America's darkest domestic mysteries. His story endures, less as a tale of clear answers and more as a cautionary reminder. Sometimes, even those who vow to heal can leave only devastation in their wake. Vince Gilmer. There are few stories as tangled and quietly tragic as that of Dr. Vince Gilmer. In the world outside, Gilmer was seen as a gentle country doctor in rural Virginia, a man with an easy smile who knew his patients by name, remembered their birthdays, and listened with real attention. His practice was small but beloved, and for years no one suspected the storm that was building in his mind. But beneath the calm surface, something was unraveling, and the cost would be nothing less than a human life and the doctor's own future. The breaking point came in June 2004. Gilmer's father, a man with whom he shared a troubled, distant relationship, was found dead in North Carolina, strangled and left by the side of the road. The investigation quickly zeroed in on Vince, whose behavior after the death seemed erratic and disjointed. He confessed to the killing, but the story that followed was anything but straightforward. Gilmer's colleagues, friends, and even his legal team began to notice something was profoundly wrong. His movements were awkward, his speech scattered, and his memory unreliable. As the court case unfolded, Gilmer's defense was hamstrung by the absence of a proper medical diagnosis. The jury saw only the act, a son killing his father, without clear motive, remorse, or explanation. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. It wasn't until years later, when journalist and physician Dr. Benjamin Gilmer, no relation, became fascinated by the case, that the truth began to emerge. The new Dr. Gilmer discovered that Vince was suffering from undiagnosed Huntington's disease, a degenerative neurological disorder that can devastate judgment, impulse control, and behavior. By the time this came to light, Vince Gilmer had already spent nearly 2 decades behind bars. The diagnosis changed the narrative, but not the outcome. In 2022, after a long legal battle and public outcry, Gilmer was granted a conditional pardon due to his terminal illness. He was released from prison in 2024, transferred to a medical facility where he now lives out his remaining days. For Vince Gilmer, the line between victim and perpetrator is blurred by disease, circumstance, and tragedy. His story is a somber reminder of how fragile the boundary is between healer and prisoner, and how easily a mind can become its own worst enemy, even for those who once pledged to do no harm. Xiu-Ying, Lisa, Tseng. Some stories unfold quietly, almost anonymously, but the legacy of Dr. Xiu-Ying, Lisa, Tseng sent ripples through the entire medical world. For years, Dr. Tseng worked as an internist in Southern California. Her office, a modest space frequented by desperate faces, patients seeking relief from pain, and in many cases seeking prescriptions for powerful painkillers. In the beginning, Tseng was like any other doctor, balancing compassion with caution. But over time, her practice became something darker, a destination for those who wanted opioid prescriptions without question, a place where pills flowed freely and paperwork was little more than a formality. It wasn't just one mistake or a single bad decision. Prosecutors would later uncover that Tseng had written thousands of prescriptions for oxycodone, methadone, and Xanax, often with little more than a cursory examination. The cost was measured not in dollars, but in human lives. Over 3 years, dozens of patients died from overdoses, their families left bewildered and broken. 3 cases, in particular, Michael Jackson, Vu Nguyen, and Stephen Ogle, became the heart of a precedent-setting criminal trial, with Tseng charged with second-degree murder for her reckless prescribing. The courtroom was filled with the grief of mothers, fathers, and friends, all testifying to the damage that unchecked prescriptions had wrought. For the first time in American history, a doctor was held criminally responsible for deaths caused by prescription drugs. In 2016, Tseng was convicted and sentenced to 30 years to life in prison, a warning sent through the entire medical community that the oath to do no harm had legal teeth. Now, Tseng spends her days far from exam rooms and white coats, her medical license forever revoked. Her case marks a line in the sand, a grim acknowledgement that even unintentional harm can bring the most severe consequences. For families forever changed by her choices, the punishment may feel like a hollow victory, but it stands as a powerful reminder. The hands that heal can sometimes take away everything. Richard Pride Boggs. Richard Pride Boggs wore many masks throughout his life, a respected neurologist, a trusted confidant, and, beneath it all, a careful schemer. For years, Dr. Boggs practiced medicine in Glendale, California, his reputation spotless and his reassuring manner. But behind closed doors, he nurtured a secret ambition for more, a life cushioned by wealth regardless of the cost. In 1988, that ambition took a deadly turn, setting into motion a plot that would ultimately shock the medical world and land him behind bars for life. The plan was audacious. Boggs, along with two accomplices, conspired to murder an unsuspecting man named Ellis Henry Green for a $1.5 million life insurance payout. The victim was lured into Boggs's medical office, drugged, and suffocated. What followed was an elaborate attempt to pass Green's body off as that of Melvin Eugene Hansen, one of the co-conspirators, in order to collect on a massive policy. Boggs forged medical records, signed the death certificate, and coordinated the fraudulent paperwork. For a brief moment, it seemed they might get away with it. But the plot began to unravel. Discrepancies in dental records and persistent investigation by insurance companies exposed the ruse. The web of lies fell apart under the weight of evidence, fake identities, altered documents, and Boggs's own professional fingerprints left at the scene. Prosecutors built their case meticulously, detailing each step in the crime, each phone call, each signature that contributed to Green's death. The trial was swift and damning. In 1990, Richard Pride Boggs was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, receiving a life sentence with no hope for parole. Once a healer, Boggs became a cautionary tale, a doctor whose hunger for money eclipsed his duty to protect life. Locked away in a cell, stripped of titles and privileges, Boggs is remembered less for the lives he once saved than for the life he took, and the cold calculation that led him down a path from doctor to murderer. Darius A. Paduch. Sometimes, the damage done by a doctor isn't measured in lives lost, but in innocence shattered. For years, Dr. Darius A. Paduch worked as a urologist in some of the most respected hospitals in New York, earning accolades and positions of authority. But behind his professional facade, Paduch harbored secrets that would eventually destroy his career and haunt his victims forever. The allegations began as whispers, rumors that some patients, including minors, felt uneasy during examinations. Those whispers became a chorus as more and more victims stepped forward, describing in painful detail the abuse they endured at his hands. The scope of the accusations was staggering. Over more than a decade, Paduch was accused of repeated sexual assaults against dozens of vulnerable patients. Investigators uncovered a pattern. Patients who trusted him, who believed in his expertise, left appointments carrying a burden of shame and confusion. Many were too afraid to speak up, silenced by Paduch's authority and their own uncertainty. But eventually, the evidence became impossible to ignore. Survivors testified in court, some barely able to meet his gaze, others determined to see justice served not just for themselves, but for everyone Paduch had hurt. When the verdict came in, it felt both monumental and insufficient. In 2024, Paduch was sentenced to life in prison, a punishment rare for crimes of this kind, but a reflection of the extraordinary harm he had inflicted. The courtroom was heavy with relief and grief, a strange mixture that often accompanies the end of such a long ordeal. For the medical world, the case sent shockwaves, the realization that even those who have taken the Hippocratic Oath can become predators, hiding in plain sight. Today, Darius Paduch is another inmate number in a system built to contain men like him. His story is a reminder that power, unchecked and unquestioned, can be twisted into something monstrous. For his victims, the sentence may not bring healing, but it does bring an end to the silence and a small measure of accountability in a world that often feels stacked against those who speak out. Reinaldo Rivera Ortiz, Jr. Sometimes, evil in medicine is as subtle as it is chilling. Dr. Reinaldo Rivera Ortiz, Jr. was an anesthesiologist in Dallas, Texas, trusted with the safety of patients on the operating table until a pattern of tragedy began to emerge at the hospital where he worked. It started with unexpected cardiac emergencies during routine surgeries. Healthy patients, young and old, suddenly went into crisis, sometimes dying on the table or suffering catastrophic injuries. At first, no one could understand why. Behind the scenes, investigators began to piece together the puzzle. The answer was as shocking as it was simple: tampered IV bags. Ortiz, angry over disciplinary actions taken against him, had allegedly sabotaged IV fluids by injecting them with dangerous drugs. Innocent colleagues and patients became collateral damage in what prosecutors called a campaign of vengeance and chaos. The operating room, supposed to be a place of trust and healing, had been transformed into a silent battlefield, with unsuspecting victims paying the price. Ortiz's arrest sent shockwaves through the medical community and the city at large. Families grieved, hospital staff reeled, and the public wondered how such horror could hide behind a doctor's credentials. The trial was a procession of sorrow, expert witnesses, grieving families, and a trail of evidence that pointed to Ortiz's calculated malice. In 2024, Ortiz was sentenced to 190 years in prison, effectively a life sentence, with no hope of parole. The punishment was severe, but the devastation he left behind was deeper still. Now, Ortiz lives out his days behind bars, his medical career obliterated, his reputation forever stained. His story stands as a grim warning. Even a single act of betrayal in medicine can ripple outward, destroying trust and lives in its wake. For every patient who passed through his care, there remains an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, the person holding your life in their hands may be the one you need to fear most. When a healer turns harmful, the consequences echo far beyond the prison walls. These doctors, once trusted with lives, now serve their own sentences, haunted by choices that cannot be undone. Their stories remind us that even those trained to save can cross the line, and justice in America is not spared for a white coat. Most serve life, not death, because the law demands proof of true intent. In the end, broken trust is a wound not easily healed.